She's the PhD Papist professor in the University of Sao Paulo. She will be the next commissioner of the Bienal in the Arts Center La Panera. Her activism and resistance between Latin America and Spain she has been working with Ignacio Acosta. Secondly, we also have Malena Bedoya. She historian and independent curator in museology and patrimony of the University of Los Andes, Simón Bolívar in the Ecuador. She's a postdoctoral PhD commissioner for the project Comics and Race in Latin America from the University of Manchester in the UK. She's also from 1829-1815 by the University of Rosario, Argentina, 2021. Thirdly, we have Carolina Bustamante. She's a mother, migrant, researcher, curator, and cultural manager. She works in the production of exhibitions and the development of artistic projects with two lines of research and interests that work specifically the anti-colonial criticism and anti-racism for maternity, childhood, and play from a political and public dimension, collective of thinking and action that has been claiming the culture in Madrid since 2010, and with whom they have generated one of these creation programs that have artistic residences and mediation and artistic education and community, always focused on the anti-racist policy and culture. Finally, we have Hassan Lopez. He's a professor in aesthetic and art theories in the University of Valencia. He's a doctor of philosophy and has a PhD in philosophy and social and cultural anthropology. He's an author of several books, among we have The Chamber and the Camera, Colonial Information from 2014, and ethnological exhibitions. Aesthetics and the Contemporary Artistic Creation from 2017, A History of African Photography at the South of Sahara, Dynamics, Trends, and Aesthetics from 2024. I think we have a good lineup, and I think we're going to learn so much in this roundtable. Maria, whenever you want. I'm here as a moderator. I'm going to be talking from 7 to 10 minutes to make an introduction to the table, because after these 2 days there are like so many things that have been said that, well, we have tackled things that have been key in this debate. So just to thank you for organizing this table and giving us the opportunity of being here and sharing our work. As I said, we have already talked about many of the key topics of this debate, and I wanted to contribute with some aspects, because many of the things that we have talked about, they are aligned with what I have worked with. There's a lot of fear of getting things wrong in museums. There's a lot of fear in general, and sometimes that has been described institutionally a decolonization process. It has been described as a learning process, and in order to learn, it's not just unavoidable to make mistakes, but it's also an important part of learning. So it's important to create spaces where making mistakes is productive and not punitive, so that we can grow together in learning. In the public sphere, they're starting to be more interested. I'm thinking more about the press, about the media, of the review of colonial history of our heritage, and the global theory of this whole debate when it comes to repatriations. But I think it was also interesting to say that institutional criticism in practice
And it's very important to point it out and highlight it, because it's a paradox that it's really interesting for me, and I think it has to be evident. On one side, it's been crucial, and it's been used to legitimate all those communities through this language, through this terminology that is being legitimate. But of course, also the contemporary arts, or the theory of the contemporary arts, um, I think has to be um, brought up in this debate. And I think it's an opportunity for us to learn. I think that academy has to be included, and again, to consider art as a creation of thought. And it's a concept that is very advanced in its task. We also mentioned before other kind of artists that were part of constitutional phenomenon. And I think it's very interesting. I really liked Amanda's speech because she's included in a project I've been working with other artists, and we've been interviewing activists from South America and from other parts of the world. Next year, we will present some fragments of this interview, of course, with the consent of the people who participated near the museum, especially in the collections of South America art. We've been very active in this vision as something very much alive, together with these visions, these institutional visions. And she's also part of these projects. In the museological part, we have very different experiences, like the one I just mentioned in Netherlands, and this is an investigation center. I think it could be a reference for the work. I really hope it could be done here too. And it's an investigated center in Amsterdam, and basically it's related and linked with different activists, investigators, and also artists since the beginning of their path. The economical investments for a project like this one, I'm sorry, I think I was talking too fast. The economical investment implies that a project like this shows a really big commitment with the change and some complexities of the process. Basically, we have a lot of tools and bibliography. We've been working a lot in this field, in this topic, both in the practical and theoretical field. But this is something, what we're going to talk about today, something related to the Spanish territory. As we've been mentioning, racist vision is very different according to the country develops in, and it's related to all the backgrounds. And of course, every country needs their own strategies to discover them and fight them. This also implies to establish strategies in every context to help those countries to try and repair and find some solutions. So my questions for the participants of this table, considering these needs of contextualizing, what are the tactics or strategies that we could develop to rethink the museums of our context, what kind of initiatives or what kind of initiative you can propose, especially in our context and in an urgent way, and how would you do it? So it's just general questions, sorry, but I think it's very interesting to see the little details of this. So how can we consider the little details and start the work from there? I think we can talk just in order. I just have 2 slides, so I'm going to be pretty much quick. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really happy to be here today. My name is Malena Bedoya. I'm actually an historian, public historian, and I've been working. I've been really committed in museums, especially in my country, Ecuador, and I've been also working with the academy, and in some way, um, it gave me tools to have a different overview and visions about everything. And something that I wanted to tell, and I would like to comment the questions that were brought up, especially on the curator's part, and also the two following questions that Maria mentioned before. Basically, I wanted to start with an essay, and it's just a map of some concepts. And I did this, I was inspired by the work of Arturo Escobar, that comes actually from the participative work, the work with the communities, and basically highlighting the importance of subjectivity in this world. How can we talk of museums and about all the emotions that are around this world of museums? In my personal case, I work with some topics that are related to fear. I think Amanda mentioned it before, and also how these communities connect to what we feel in the museums, especially pain and other different emotions that are negative. And sometimes these emotions have a really big role in what we feel and what we live every day in our job, in what we do. And this and in this sense, I think it's very much included in the heritage topic. In the personal, for me, when I talk about museums, I already mentioned a lot of topics about museums. I worked directly and closer with communitary museums. So I think that understanding this in South America, especially, helped me and put me closer to this kind of experience. And this comes from another path and other different grammars of feeling and understanding this world. And I really believe that the typology of the museums that has to be decolonized is the European one. But I think we put aside other museological paths, like the communitary, for example, the one we call this way, and they call themselves like live museums basically, and this process is really common in my country, like the one that's called Otabalango is just an example, and they make us recognize that those paths are valid and are existing, and they're pretty much related to the world and what we lived in South America, especially for the sociology part of the trajectory. And this is something we have to recognize and make valid to understand that this idea of the coloniality is not new, and there's other way to rebuild and think about museology in general. And in the case, I related to some of my colleagues. Together, we're working about a book about museology for women, most of them in situation of poverty, of violence, conflict. And we've been talking about all the different conflicts in the national state, especially for military topics, and challenging the whole heritage in itself. And also recognizing these communitary museums in other contexts, in other nations are different. There's a very big variety, and they've been working protected by the state in most of the case. So I think that recognizing this means recognizing this diversity of experience. So starting from that, we ask ourselves how we decolonize the European museums. What's the perspective that we want to give to this process of decolonization? And in my case, also as teacher at university, I can tell you that, and I would like to start with this. And in some kind of sense, this my response, my answer is related to this topic. And firstly, one of the curator practice is necessarily just to transform all this process in a pedagogy of the go back and learn again from the beginning. Recently there's been a book that's been published, and the main topic is basically the reflective work that we all do to relearn, and the possibility we have now to relearn about this process. And I think this is a very complex and difficult process, and it's like just go back to the beginning and start all over again. And I think we have to recognize to what's the difference exactly between these two things, because the person that learns and try to learn from others has usually very positive results. And again, just go back and try to relearn from the beginning makes us understand that knowledge and learning is a possibility of resistance. And I'm talking about an exercise of revision, basically, and this is a possibility that allow us to push our limits and challenging ourselves and our institutions. And I think that shouldn't establish the conflict. And this is the second point that for me is fundamental. I think in the last roundtable we talked about this. And we talked about the public as a general concept, but sometimes we use this term and we do not know what we're referring to. As I said before, I'm a public historian, and I've always worked with the idea that museums are a space for conflict. And I really consider, I believe, that museums are a place where nothing is neutral and where we're always negotiating on a side to just keep maintaining a conservative politics. And I think that is the roots of the majority of the museums in the world, almost, or just starting to resist and promote other alternatives that are more democratic. And we have to think how, especially from where to start, and also to consider the museum as an educational place, not formal. So given that context, to assume, of course, it's a responsibility for the public, and basically understanding education as something merely political. We have to try to think about how we legitimate the history and the process. I think it's a fundamental task, and we have to think how we learn about this. And I have also a third point that I think is fundamental, and probably this comes from the fact that I've been really close to different processes in museums where we have a director that does all the functions in the museums. So security, he sells the tickets, and he's a mediator. He does everything in the museum. And I I always talk about this with my students. Sometimes you don't really have a team of mediators. And sometimes in those spaces, museology becomes the center of the topic. So what do I want to say with this? I've been really surprised every time. Whenever I go in museums, what surprises me is the feeling you have when you go in, and this is something that we have to think about. It's a space that's been thought in a certain way, that's been designed in a certain way, and it's not just an accessibility topic, but also the ones that can go in and the ones that cannot go in the museum. the possibility to sustain the mediation team, and if museums can survive and coexist with the different governments in the countries. We were talking about this in the coffee break. So, in my vision, my perspective, museology is not just a mere exhibition of pieces or just a space where we just have objects and paintings. Um, I think if we think about experiences of other kind of museologies, for example, in Italy or other countries, how they interact in those spaces, it changes given the context. So, as I said before, museum, the concept of museum implies to consider the selection of the space and also how we can transform these spaces in a dynamic space. Moreover, I don't really like to use the term of participation, even if after I would like to talk about this. It's a term that I put there in my presentation. And when, for example, we think about the institutional transformation, I think that the first speaker, Hannah, pointed it out, and I think this is very complex. These concepts are wide, they're very big, and we use it both in the real space and not real space, and they're part of the documentation of the state bureaucracy. And you have just to start filling up and try to understand if you did the correct thing. And this process of transformation, all the debates. Transform in administrative tools, basically, and all the dynamics that happen inside and outside the museum. And I think we saw this when we talked about gender violence and how this happens in the different realities. And sometimes it's absorbed by the government forms. And about the last two questions, I think I still have time, I'm not sure. I try to unify them. The initial proposal to help museums with the colonial problems, I think the question is really dense and hard. I think we've been talking about this all day, or at least thinking about it. I basically worked with museum archives. I've been doing follow-ups of museology processes, especially in institutional museums and national museums, both in Colombia and Ecuador, and also Peru, at the beginning of 2020. And I think it's very interesting how we understand the strategy of the state-nation in the different ideologies. And it's very interesting how this deployed in the museum space. However, I think I don't really get it wrong. Um, I could give some specific names about the collectors and the ones who participated in the collections in the three countries I mentioned before. I think in the case of the European continent, I think one of the speakers was talking about diplomacy before, and I would like to talk about these diplomatic agendas about the European museums. I think this is a central point, and I've been always knowing this since I started working in this path. For example, mentioning the main collectionists in Ecuador related to the collectionists in Spain, or even the ones in Colombia. They were following some very difficult processes. And in this case, I could tell you everything about it, but I think this diplomatic agenda is full, is charged of three components. Basically, the white elite, so a class problem, capitalism, and prestige, basically. we can just analyze what's happening now in the present reality. And of course, this diplomacy part is always trying to install an order that ends sustaining, supporting this white privilege. And we can actually review all the current diplomacy in what's happening in all the countries. And I think the archives of these museums, how collections were built in the European scenario, we have to analyze exactly the path they've been following. For what I know, these collections of these museums, for what I understood, have this part of diplomacy that also includes donations, basically between white men of good family. So usually it's a moral question. And most of the time, a lot of them were supported uh, by scientific scenarios that legitimated the process. So when you understand exactly who were the people negotiating, you can understand the whole picture. For example, the collection that was founded by Pedro Franco Davila. Um, I think you can understand a lot of the parts of my history and my presentation. You can understand the relation. Um, you can understand this situation where a lot of these collectionists were related to minery or petrol, basically to something that it's a white capitalism that's acting in this scenario. And all the time when people ask me what archaeology, for example, or museums are related to these two components, I always answer that everything, exactly everything. And this is because it's basically determined by it. And the same happened in Colombia and Ecuador. So I think there's a very strict relationship between collectionism and this scenario in a lot of countries. I'm not inventing these data, but I'm not gonna deepen into this topic. I've been studying and investigating on this, but it's another history. But I would just to like to let it clear and make you understand, even if we think about other topics, like we've been talking about racism and other current topics. And as I said before, European museums, so certain, some of them, are going through a very difficult process, and the museum I was talking about at the beginning has a very big power in that sense. And with this, I wanted to tell something about transformation and utopias and the cultural workers. And I think I have to wrap up with a checklist syndrome, what we mentioned before, of the big concepts that are not understandable, that sometimes we give as a solution or just formulas. So those big concepts that we think as solutions, I think that is very dangerous. Can you pass to the other slide, please? Thank you. This is one of the work that I love of an artist from Ecuador, Angelica Lomoto, and she's a Napo Runa artist. And in the framework of the context of Ecuador, about, as we said before, the nature rights, the intercultural state, and more, Angelica was talking about what it means when interculturality is a very big concept and it was absorbed by the dynamics of the state. So I think her work is fantastic because you can see all these concepts in what she represents, and all these things basically got on fire. and thinking. Her objective is get people to think and how to understand what is the interculturality according to what she lived as a migrant, for example. And I think the ethical part in that is essential. Moreover, the moral topic of the museum I was mentioning before. So Angelica says that she doesn't use really the good practice in that sense. She has a discursive needs. She uses materials, symbols, and places that needs to be at least explored. So we can understand this concept. Um, Sometimes it's just part of the solution that the state supposedly has to give. This is just an action among among people, basically, of all categories and species. And I think something very important is to question how we understand this participation. What's the meaning of participation exactly? And to recognize different material realities of the museums, like, for example, budget topics, how to maintain the changes on a long term. If museums are just a mere space that contains objects, and how we can make them more effective. Another central point is how mediation can be an essential element in the museums. Because of course we need other forms of participation that include voices of all kind of people. I always go with my kid, and he's a teen right now, to exhibitions, and I'm really interesting about his perspective and what he understands about the exhibitions that we're talking about right now. And sometimes he understands nothing because for him, or they're boring. It seems like they telling nothing. So I think we have an adult-centered vision, and I think this is very important to understand what's the public. And if we talk about people with other capacities or difficult certain difficult, we have, I think, to rethink to what we exhibit and what we expose. I think I have to wrap up with this. So, what does that mean to just treat with some objects? We need to see a lot of things, for example, that circulate on the internet. We have to go back and put them in the museum, for example. In my previous project, we worked on anti-racism, and one of the questions was, for example, if you go and put again a painting that's basically racist in a museum, you're trying to basically keep going with this concept of racism. Or I think we have to generate other care forms, basically, and this is a commitment. So how can we take care of these topics in museums? And I will conclude saying that the the topic of utopia is basically an idea, because in this world, uh, in my country, for example, we don't have water, we don't have electricity, and everything is happening very fast, and the horizon is very far away and very complex. And sometimes to maintain utopias is what is maintaining us alive, and try to destroy the borders, basically. And the question is, how can these utopias connect us, and how can we consider ourselves as cultural workers that have a common interest, and how can we have a political imaginary that is transforming. And I would like to conclude with a friend, an artist. Yauri Menala, and this is a concept that I love. It's linked to a concept that we've been talking about in this table. And I'm not sure we talked about this before, and I don't know if we really understood the topic. And he says that he uses something called Nyanda Maniaci, and it's basically a thought and an expression. And the translation is basically borrow me the path, and basically understanding and supporting a path uh, where whatever looks enclosed and that do not include others, just to allow ourselves on a side to be able to understand the scenario and act consequently, especially taking into account the spirituality. And this entails reflections and just being together among artists like Angelica in Ecuador, Auri, to work together and have a common territory. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for this invitation. I'm going to start by replying to the title of this roundtable to start making a couple of broad orientations that I think are important to frame where I'm talking from to see how to make some more specific notes to have strategies for the practice of these exhibitions. And this is in the framework of Madrid's context, which is where it has been developed as a practice related to this topic that I think could be expanded to a general state of Spain. I'm going to read so that I don't rumble too much and so that I can limit my space to the time that I've been asked. I'll start with an affirmation that, at least at first, denies the premise that convocates this table, which is that strategy look out to change the practices of the commissariat and in the in the internal colonialisms in the museums in Spain. I mean that repairing colonialism does not happen or does not go through commissioners. I think commissioners can be a part of repairing when they give space to the voices of those people who have not had that space before. So the conclusion would be managing the context, creating critical knowledge, activating spaces for dialogue and reflection, mediating between institutions, artists, both with all genders and non-binary gender as well, and also opening up cracks through which there is no way in repairing. I think repairing is something that happens more in the field of the country and the civil society through political policies. And it talks about a new social agreement that is open to transform radically official narratives about history and building new ways to have relationships so that they are fair and just to all diversities. So what I wanted to say was that we can't really talk about repairing as such without actually making it easier for the topic, without talking about dismantlement, acknowledgement, and healing both the colonial historical wound and its reparation in the present. For me, it is too early to talk about repairing when socially we're still not able to talk about history, to talk about colonial values and their consequences without very commonly finding censorship, evasion, and the consequences of what we call white fragility. That means a defensive and deactivator answer that very quickly wants to escape the conflict that the past and the present is offering them. I mean that this is more of a positive action that starts building that idea of consensus. I'm not saying that it's wrong to try to build alliances and weaving, but we haven't even had spaces to fight conflict. It's like wanting to cover an infected wound without opening that wound, without healing that wound. I mean to a specific context in which we're in right now. This trend of deactivating the debate, I think, is something that we should stop and think about, because over the last weeks, in different opportunities that I had, I could be in different talks similar to this one, and I found different positions that were coming from the academia that make us wonder about the colonial thinking and creating a block that is contradicting the imperiophilical discourses from the far right. So there are a series of ideas, and of course, the decolonial theory opposes the Hispanistic kind of discourse, but the problem in terms, let's say, very binary terms, is that it reduces both ideas or positions, and it limits, on the one hand, the acknowledgement of how severe the real impact is of far right country far right ideas have in our migrant lives, and it's also just a polarizing lever. This reading of polarization precisely talks about the need of going over the binary thinking to have new spaces for thinking and reflection. But somehow, what we do is to act on that external anti-racist analysis so that we can offer an active way to fight for life material situations of people who have been crossed by systemic violence. So that's the solution to that, because if we don't pay attention to how we want to frame the anti-racist thinking, the decolonialistic thinking, or however you want to call it, in a respectful way, in a committed way, from a position in which we're listening, this whole process of decolonization or looking for a repairing that we are chasing, the risk that we have is depolitize it and to lack the powers in the anti-colonialistic fight. On the other hand, I wanted to say that we should not be talking about internal colonialism when we talk about the Spanish context. I think it is very specific when it comes to Latin American societies that have a lot of colonial practices that have to do with territories, with different power practices, with different projects that have happened there, with the multiplication of colonialism there and the extractivism. If by internal colonization we're talking about the British colonies, we are talking about discrimination ways that they have submitted the migrant or racialized population in Spain, and those in Spain that are descendants and they're aware of the different processes of immigration, and it's more social than structural racism. And I think this is something that's important, because when we have that institutionalization of racism, I think that's what we should be targeting in this process towards the decolonization and even representation. Now I'm going to see the exhibition itself. I don't want to explain it in too much detail, and I don't want to repeat too much about the character and the colonial origin of the museum and its institutions. But I wanted to give a new definition of the museum by using words of my dear Francisco Godoy Vega, who's here, and I will call him Pacho from here on because I will mention him later. It's a free quotation from his book, Uses and Habits of the White People. And he defines museums like political devices that will work inside the necessity of scientific classification of the world that has been imposed by the colonial project that will be erected as one of the institutions that build validation systems of the racial division of the world. So, who will have the right to collect and who will be a collectible option. So, then the museum will be crucial as mechanisms to build identities and collective imaginaries that reproduce or erect different options than the colonial system. And at the same time, they can be crucial systems to build systems that are going to deconstruct that same structure. What we have today is a way to institutionalize racism that has a symbolic power, which is huge when it comes to the installation of a real idea at a very broad social level with regards to how we place white bodies and non white bodies. So they have that power of recording and building consciously and subconsciously that operation through which the white body is diluted and they start occupying the space of the being. And just like everything else, it disappears because of the differentiation of a subalternate scale. I'm thinking of an example of this. And this explains how society has been educated in racism through exhibitions. They showed us that we should see white bodies as bodies that could be possessed, that could be made as animals, they could be categorized, they could be exposed for the leisure of European society. On the other hand, by reaching the point that I wanted to reach, human zoos have been presented as tools, as methodologies and explain life under the mask of the great truth that is scientific and objective. But human zoo is hiding its scientific value under its anthropological value, saying that it's given some value to the humanity, and knowing that this is being disseminated from the academia and great truths are what explains the world. So then this is a space for production of knowledge which is true from the point of view of authority. These validation techniques, through the way that it works, having the root in the discrimination systems, we are going to see them happening in the current dynamics that have the presence or the lack of presence of bodies of the global south in the Latin American countries areas. And this again goes to see who has the valid content. So then who should have the power of speaking, who should have the power of decision making about representation in museum exhibitions exhibitions, and then who has access to the white academy, who uses their language, and who creates from a valid system of enunciation and validation. Together with this, we should also be mentioning the idea of artistic quality that is so present when we talk about the selection of artists over others. For example, Luciagaña in his book says that cultures are not highways; museums could be gardens, and saying that artistic quality is a term that is understood as a universal standard and an adjective that are required from some creators to be considered in the art system without considering the artistic quality as a concept. And I wanted to quote Lucia here that we handle from aesthetic, political, history, and Western examples. With regards to this, I'm going to talk about this exhibition It's a project that we did in 2014 with Pacho in La Casa Encendida. It was one of the projects that was selected for the Inedit um, contest, and it's in a moment in which people did not talk about this in Madrid, so our presence and the presence of many of the artists that participated in this exhibition was barely represented, or there was a null representation of the context of the city and Spain as a country. So the exhibition has as a starting point 1992, as a starting symbolic point, as a political starting point, and then it creates a map with proposals that reflect on the migrant topic in Spain as its historic, let's say, definition and its current situation. Something I also think is important is that it's almost impossible to find this discourse in this institution. And some years ago, when we started to work with Pacho and started to be working in institutions and our work, we did that with the total certainty that we were going to be rejected. In fact, we had already did it in 2013 with a project that was very similar, it was not considered. So when we earned this calling, we were very surprised. And even though what I'm going to say is, it seems as an anecdote of who is the person in charge, who's the expert. And one of the main reasons why in 2014 an institution such as Casa Encendida has this project, beyond the fact that it's a project that as a concept is very solid and marvelous with a lot of artistic quality, is because one of the juries from the contest seems to be an expert that comes from Latin America, that is sensitive to our topics. So the dynamics of selections of the Inedit test is that there are three juries and each one will choose a project, and the Latin American jury was the one that chose us. So then we saw how important it is to have our presence in the decision instances. Pablo, who was Pablo León de la Barra, he wrote in a letter that then was published in the catalog talking about how they picked the project among the other 59 projects that they reviewed. They said that ours is the one that talks about an urgency that I felt and that I felt in others. In his words, it's a project that goes about everything that no one talks about and what no one wants to see. Not about the trauma that happened in the common citizen in Spain because of the crisis, but also what lies underneath. Migrants, those who are not even called citizens. Let's say that what back then was an exception, I mean the presence of racialized voices in an institution talking about coloniality and decoloniality, today has become something acclimated, made from superior instances like the ICOM, the Ministry of Culture. And this right now, this request has been seen as an increase of funding and initiatives about this matter, but for that to become a truly repairing process, as this table is wondering, we can't stop but and we can't help but think, how can we achieve the goal of the colonization of the museum is not just a change in the programming, but also a change in the decision-making process of institutions, and how can we open up the spaces for talking as a structural change and not as a specific change in a culture. Having said all this, I wanted to note down four, let's say, strategies or different ways of what we could call the anti-racist curatorship, if that's a concept. And I think they could be considered with regards to this matter about how to exercise some kind of transformative curatorship. First one would be the trans-historical regard, or an idea of a circular time. And here I want to talk about the idea of escaping the progressist and linear idea of Western logic to make an interconnected view of the past, the present, and the future that allows for the exercise of memory and invention as ways to interpret and transform the present. I'm going to make a quick example because of time. I wanted to see the whole broad structure of what we did by criticizing the migrant reasoning. We started with a registry of the works of Francesco Resque, which is Chronicles of a Missing Item, is something that he did in the Church of San Luis de Sevilla in the context of the project Plus Ultra from Marbella Espesa. It was thought as a critical contestation to what happened in the 92 in the Universal Exhibition that was happening in the city. And the work was important because of the symbolic presence of Colón and because it hosted two temporalities that were fundamental to frame the problem of immigration, which is the story of Columbus's trip in the same year, the 92, which is a very complex year. Many things are happening. We have the 500 years of the conquest, and Spain is celebrating their entry in the European Union. The project was followed by this project from Guillermo Gómez Peña y Coco Fusco, which is called The Year of the White Bear Take Two, that then was called Two Undiscovered Amerindians Visit the West, and then it becomes a video that picks up the whole project. It's a series of performances in which Fusco and Gómez Peña create a historic fiction in which they start acting as two natives that Columbus did not actually get to. They are caged and they are exposed to the European Western audience, and they are not told that it is a performance. They're there as they are, and the performance inverts the regard, and what they did was to observe how the European audience interacts with those alleged native people. For the first time in 1992, this happened in the Biennial of Performance, and then it becomes a 2-year tour in different anthropology museums all over the world. While we were seeing that work of art that was talking about the building of the otherness, that also makes a reference to that colonial history, that 92, the same moment in which they are presenting. And all the processes of a clear reference to human zoos. And right at the exit of the cage, what we did was to put a selection of photographs from human zoos that have happened here in Madrid and the Retiro Park that belong to the collection of the National Museum of Anthropology that at the time worked with us in this project. And these three works of art created this first link of diverse temporalities about different positions that opened the exhibition, and they placed the historic idea of the colonial otherness and their future. From there, the exhibition had other contemporary requests, and what they did was to tend to the contemporary consequences of temporality in Spain. As it could be the stereotyped access to the racist system, the access to work, the Foreigners Act, massive deportations, among other things. The exhibition closed with this work of art by Nola Gomarsino, which is called More Delicate Than the Historian Are the Mapmaker's Colors, which is the name of a performance from 2013 in which Bruno goes there with his dad against the statue called like the Egg of Columbus that was built in the 1992 in Sevilla. And in an action that at the same time is pathetic and poetically liberating, what they do is to throw a dozen eggs to the statue. They worked with them as a movement in in a spiral of time at the beginning, but with a very different temporality, and also thinking about a freeing exercise that was future forward looking. There are temporalities of activation of the past, of the present, of the recognition of the different historic moments that these things happen. There's a power and a space to be explored that can be specifically significant for the case of collections that may be the ones from the Museum of America or the Anthropology Museum, where objects appear a bit lost in an ambiguous historicity. So, second item that I wanted to point out was understanding the exhibition as an activation political point. Here, what Malena was saying drew my attention, because we need to understand museum as a live space that calls out to their context and is not just an exhibition of visual discourses, and it's more about creating a political experience that affects and create relationships from the body and the action with the spectator. With this regard, I bring the example of some of the things that we did or that happened in this critical to the migrant reasoning work. This is a work of art of Silvia Martin. She recovers the story of Sama Martine, a citizen that migrates to Spain. She was born in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and she died being sent back because she did not have enough medical attention or assistance. She recovers the story of Samba, and then she starts a research on similar cases of migrant people that have been illegal, that die inside the SEIs, which is the centers for um, for the integration of immigrants. And she makes this story closer to us. When the exhibition was open in 2014, the deaths of the Tarajal had just happened, where 15 migrant people died drowning because of the border control of the Spanish authorities. And there have been a series of protests in the cities against the acts of for foreigners, the centers for recruiting foreigners. And what we did was to have a negotiation with the institution so that we can, let's say, dismember or just open up or give the objects that had been produced, which are an artistic object, to give them to the collectives that had been manifesting or protesting, to activate them in these political protests. But that was against several rules of the institution about how to understand the artistic object, about security, about preservation. And they did this, and they activated things in other way, and they updated the problem in a very strong way in the present. I think in this sense I wanted to highlight the exploration of the artistic practices of action and performance as a very essential message to mediate from the body that relationship between the object, the artistic discourse, and material life. I think there we have other of the strengths of this way of doing that has to do with managing and giving those spaces for activation from the exhibitional space. In this sense, talking about the action and language of the action and performance, I always think about what's going to be the IU collective in many opportunities, but most especially I think about their work in the artistic residence in Matadero that resulted in the Devuélvanos el Oro, Give Us Back the Gold exhibition, which was actions from different institutions from Spain that had to do with the colonial matter, like the general archive of Indies in Seville or here in the National Anthropology Museum, in which they propose a radically anti-colonial exercise of dialogue with the institutions, with their collections, with historical criticism and systemic that has been mediated through the artistic message of symbolic and poetic activity. The next point was understanding artistic practice as a way of healing, where we can go through the pain collectively to look for the construction of imaginary positions that are going to escape colonial logistics, because I would say that the anti-racist possibilities that I see around me, it's more than just a practice of art because we want to do art. It's a tool that we have used in order to articulate pain. It's a way to find others, of sharing from empathy, from uncomfortableness, from creativity, that analysis of the operations that cross us to generate long and continued processes of creation of a dialogue that ensure a deep work that escapes consumeristic options and that logic that makes us stay separated when we want to be together, we want to be collective, where we help each other in order to give possibility for the context. But we can acknowledge, we have to remember that our communities from migrant states or communities constantly have this fragility. So we have to articulate the artistic practice of anti-racism, because it means that we could be cancelled or censored in spaces for institutional or academic debate aspects, because we start to see a change, we start to see some interest from what we're saying. But just some years ago, when we still had not set the focus on decolonization, talking about these topics could mean that we could close many opportunities of working and developing projects in the cultural sphere in Spain. So we have had to create our own shelters and our own independent institutions. I'm thinking about the Parceria, about Felipe Manuel, about the Afro space. And something I would like to highlight today is that in this path of the decolonization of the museum, we need to be aware that we are going to go through an uncomfortable path. And the commitment towards creating more communitary, dignified and honest spaces starts by being uncomfortable and looking at that violence through this healing, ritual and spiritual policy and anti-racist policy. I could give a lot more examples of things that have happened in our spaces, but I think I'm going to again go to the IU collective because, well, I love them, and this collective has taught us many things, and they have developed a deeply radical and committed practice with the creation of spaces for processing collective pain, imagination of healing, and claiming pleasure and migrant pleasure. This is a photo from the Biennale in Sydney in 2020. And this is the little image from Our Lady of the Papers, Nuestra Señora de los Papeles, which is a work of art that is done in our exhibition, Our Oath, Nuestro Juramento, in Santa Mónica, in Centre d'Art de Santa Mónica in Barcelona. And it has this idea of what's ritual, what's important for this community. It has been so essential to understand what happens to us and where we are in this place. And where to wrap up, I wanted to make a brief observation of a linguistic idea that opens up a space of reflection about this practice of generating exhibitions. I have always felt more comfortable, and it was one of the fights of the catalog of the texts of the Casas en Vida, by using the term curatorship on the term commissioners. Curatorship, even though it is true that it's related to an to the English concept curator. It can also be explained by its lexical roots from the Latin term curare, which means to take care of or to worry about someone, and tor, that talks about people, the person making an action, and all this is accompanied by the suffix ia, that talks about profession. So curatorship, curadoria, would be the job of someone who takes care of and worries about taking care of something or someone. And this is a political view, but for me, um, being a commissioner is something more hierarchical, more political, and it talks about selecting from the figure of authority. Maybe one of the first strategies to face this problem of decolonization from commissioner would be to go from a commissioner to a curatorship. And I think I'm going to stop here. Thank you. Good afternoon. I think I'm going to change a little bit the topic because I don't want to talk about one or the other. I don't like curator and I don't like commissioner, and I would rather associate the curatoria, because I speak Valencian, to taking care of others. Well, anyway, I want to get straight to the point in this sense. And first of all, if I can open this up, I would like to place the framework of my reflection precisely because we have had a lot of people over the morning, and it's not the same to think about this from contemporary art, from an archaeological museum, from the Museum of America or Anthropology Museum, or matters that have to do with community practices that are non-institutional. Having said this, my reflection, taking into account the place that we're at, is going to focus on the anthropology museums that have also been called sometimes ethnology or cultures of the world, by taking into account maybe the two most important ones in our context. One of them is the Anthropology Museum of Madrid, where we are right now, and the other one is the Museum of Cultures of the World in Barcelona, especially the headquarters that we have in the center, in Carrel Moncada. In this specific case, and just to give some answer to one of the questions that Maria was thinking about, maybe from the point of view of the essential strategy, which is what to do with these museums, it would be to turn the museum itself in an object for reflection, just to take the museum, specifically its permanent exhibitions, and to put it in front of the mirror to reveal in what way it has been crossed by coloniality. All this, as it could not be any other way, with the fundamental goal of transforming the institution in a context, at least the current one, that in the theoretical plane it seems favorable. In this sense, I think it is relevant to remember that even though we're late, and as the colleagues have said, for a long time there has been quite a good resistance of making a transformation that in this sense has been a necessary transformation that needs for a critical review of museums, especially these two. And it has been the time to start a path that should have no way back. And among other things, it responds to a model of plural citizenship that in the case of Spain, I understand it as such. It should also be understood as part of the project of democratic memory. And why do I say this? I say this because what we have inherited from Francoism and National Catholicism have been expressed and become a true regime in the narratives and archives of the Anthropology Museum of Madrid and the Museum Ethnològic of Barcelona.
And this actually allows us to learn from our experience and learn from what we've been doing in the last 10 years in the European context without losing the overview of the different developments. And I'm not scared of saying that I'm part of a background that is anthropologist. It's similar to one to the American ideologist with a different representative, the post-colonial thought of the different types of the that kind of criticism. If we take into account these initial initiatives of the museums to start with this process of decolonization, and if we follow the case of the two Spanish museums, which would be the most important in the area and in the sector of anthropology, the one in Madrid and the one in Barcelona, I think the first thing we should do is to question the principle of organization in the geographical space and also the taxonomy related to social life, especially in the Museum of Anthropology in Madrid. And in the case of the one in Barcelona, the aesthetical part of their permanent exhibitions is really important. We could put an example, we could do an example of the museum in Barcelona is a collection that is in Barcelona in the pre-Columbian museum, and it would be really interesting to see the different dynamics that are being developed in the rest of the countries in Europe, and the different satellites of that kind of sector, especially in Belgium, and also the Museum Catalan in Barcelona depends and announces its creation in 2012. And apart from its statical, as I said before, features of the museum in Barcelona, that it's a special orientation, and especially the permanent collection of this museum is very important, as I said before, as a aesthetical principle. And this is an expression that is used in different societies that created the objects, and they highlight the collections of recollecting. It imposes the existing of a canon of the society these objects come from. And like in the case of Müller in Geneva, what's specified is basically a criteria of aesthetic, as I said before. That's the main principle of this museum. And what highlights is basically this aesthetical principle, especially in the artistical icons. But also we see this feature in the organization of the Museum of Anthropology in the different cultures of Barcelona. In the exhibition and the different contexts in the different floor, we can see a micro racism, and they were really useful to legitimate basically colonialism. So as we were saying before, related to the different exhibition, we can do the same exercise in Barcelona, in the museum in Barcelona. We can actually see how in the main floor we have the Black Africa. In the first floor we can see Oceania, Australia, and usually the publication of the 19th and 18th centuries, they put them on the top of the African communities, and in the second floor, America and Asia. We can do a similar exercise here in the Museum of Anthropology in Madrid. Of course, we would take out the room of origins. You can see in some of the images the body of the giant is a body that has no forms, and it's just mere curiosity. Anatomical curiosity is basically a freak, and it's just representing the figure of a freak. And it's basically a human skeleton that you can see in the right part. It coexists with other objects in the same. And we also see paintings of a black kid, and it's painted. It's a reproduction of a painting of beginning of the 18th century, I think, 1790 something, and it's being painted by Jose Padron. And they had this tradition of exotic bodies, just basically not normative bodies of the body of this black kid in this case. So if we take this part out, this room is very clear what's its context and context. When you go in, the visitor actually encounters this exhibition, this collection, and it's a collection based objects and different photographies. Um, and it comes from a previous collection that was held in actually outside in the Parque del Retiro in Madrid, and it's a context marked for the from the Spanish Empire. Afterwards, we go up to the next floor with Asia and in America on the last floor. I think in the 90s, Fernando, if I'm wrong, please correct me. I think the Eastern collection was in the space of the museum. In this context, I have to say that these colonialism grammars have to be reanalyzed, especially the limits of the anthropology dialogue and speech that's been marked on by this racist vision, and it's very important to take into account these two elements that's been also marked from the Franquismo, from the fascism in Spain, and in some way they coexist in the same space as a representative of different cultures. They're basically objects that belongs to different eras. I'm not going to go in depth of these topics, but I would like to take this opportunity and to also talk about some pictures that, of course, are less visible. I'm going to mention what my colleague said before, and this is less visible, but it's also very powerful in terms of colonialism. And I would like to propose some strategies to deactivate these processes. In this sense, it's very stimulating for me to look at this collection of images, and they proceed from the Historical Museum of Paris, and you can see the picture and the images in the screen right now. You can see the one on the top, but the rest of the pictures are in a different format, and they were purchased probably in 1883 in Paris. These images talk about the institutional relationship between Spain and Spanish and French museums, thanks to the influence of Anton, that had followed a course of anthropology in Spain, and he founded the department of the museum in Madrid. And starting from 1910, he started being the director of the Museum of Anthropology. But we have to remember that the government defended racism, especially in France, and they contributed to the idea of hierarchy of the human race. Apart from that, his idea contributed on the fact that the pictures, the images, were an evidence tool, basically, and we can see it in different museums in France. And this actually explains that when we see the archives of the Museum of Anthropology, especially those pictures that come from the Historical Museum in Paris, were not identified, especially the context of this picture, these images, especially who took the pictures. And we don't have the special context. But these pictures that come from the Historical Museum of Paris were actually taken by famous photographs like Jean Barbier, Romain Bonaparte, and Philippe Breton, and they were taken in a context of the technology exhibition that were held in 1980 in Famous Garden in Paris. And these images, they're a series of images commercialized by Hank Hagebel, and he was he's basically the founder of the human zoologic of it's a promoter of zoos of humans in Germany, especially. Um, that during the crisis of the animal zoos in the 80s, they decided to add a human part to these zoos. And these images were taken especially in occasion of the exhibitions of humans, and they were held in the capital of France. And as you can see in the images, it's different kind of people from different part of the world. We also find in the collection some images that were taken in Africa but diffused and purchased in Europe. Um, we have here one of the photographer by Edward Henry in different colonies, especially French ones. And these last ones were really popular at the time, and they basically were trying to amplify the vision of this world, and they were purchased by Anton in the same era, in the same time. The vision, the colonialism vision of the images, it's evident in this sense. There are a lot of questions that we could ask. And I always think that it's really difficult to solve and repair the damages that were made. But we could try to solve the situation with some questions like, for example, if we see this picture, these images, is an image taken by Jacques-Philippe Poteau in the 1860s, more or less, of a person from Senegal that participated in the war in the 1860s, because in that time every kind of subject that passed through the country was racialized and could be photographed in this way. But what does this mean, the description in this kind of picture, in this kind of image? And in this case, basically, we can see that the image has a sense only if there's another one of the profile, of the side of the person. And we're basically converting, transforming a person in a stereotype of an entire race. And this is happening with these images. And if we try to set a difference between the ones that were taken, of criminals and other people, they have some similarities. And this photograph I was talking about before, it was part of the Society of Paris, and he published a book called The Human Race. So you can see the classification is the same, and before starting working in this context, he was applying the same criteria in context to racialized people. And this is, of course, a naturalist conception. And they thought basically that the body sphere was just an expression of the human behavior, basically. The second question I ask myself, looking at a part of this collection, this is just a part of it, and these are images of violence, of course, and in a sense, we can say that these are pictures that belong to Bonaparte, and they're part of the ethnological exhibition. And you can see how they look at the camera. They try to resist to this violence. You can see the look of the people in the images. Some of the images, if we analyze them, we can see, for example, pride or indifference, and some others, they reveal complicity sometimes. But if you look at their eyes of the people, you can actually tell what was their situation, and probably they proceeds from the ones I mentioned before that were taken in the famous garden in Paris. We can see a kid, a little girl, 8 or 9 years old, that was photographed naked from the front and from the side. Let's think, for example, another context, a white girl of that age that is being photographed naked. It would be unimaginable. There's another picture of a lady on the right, and she was photographed also naked, and it's very uncomfortable to look at it. And we have to say that the photograph took this photograph with a traditional dress from Oruba in the same context. If the practice of taking photographs of these people looks like, as I said before, the same practice with the pictures of different criminals. And as I said before, Dalton developed a theory about the construction of human condition with the superposition of different pictures. And as you can see, it's a very brutal practice. And he was the father, almost the founder of this practice, and he was associating human features to these people that were basically naked, and their body were photographed like they were doing with animals, basically. I assisted to an exhibition in 2009, and we did a comparison with the colonial archive that is in France. Also in France, they have a very important collection of photographs of animals in in the colonies, and they compared it how they were photographing people in the same time, in the same area period. But before that, if we can try to analyze the image in a different way, it invites us to see what's the power behind the images. And all these pictures are basically in archives. This is just an example. It's a photograph in the Museum of Anthropology in Madrid, and the title, as you can see on the right part of the screen, you cannot read it, but you have to believe me. Juan Marquis Borras of an island of Cabo Verde, possibly is referring to an island of the country, and it's a photograph taken from by Jean-Philippe Boteau between 1865 or 69, and this person reminds us the legend, basically, that he was basically a jurist. And we can see here the stereotype of these people. And we can see some details of these procedures of relationship between the continent and Europe. Another form that I really find very interesting is through the names and the origins. And I think it's something very interesting that the pictures, the images of the archives of the Museum of Anthropology in Madrid um, they still have the name and the affiliations of the people that were part of the groups, and also the place of residence. And with these data, with these details, um, these people can still have a name, and this is very important to recover their memory and their history. Starting from the name, using the name, they can be reconsidered and relinked to a family structure. You can also know the exact place of origin of these groups. And to just make an example, the museum started an initiative, a very interesting initiative about this topic. The community of Sami asked the restitution of these images so they could be recognized and relinked to their families and to their groups. And this is a very important work that's been developing. Wrapping up, I would like to say that these exercises they invite us to reanalyze the archives and the different rooms of museum. They're just some invitation to decolonize the museum narratives and its collection, but without forgetting that every change has to affect all the structure of the museum. So it could be a space of relationship, possible relationship that we all desire and want. Sometimes in anthropology we use different parameters that are not really fruitful and useful, especially in the permanent exhibition at the museums. I think the mediators have a very big job, and they have a very big impact in this task. And museum cannot rebuild just one entire memory, national memory. Thank you so much. I would like to ask you a question, each one of you, and then we can start with the public, with the audience. Malena, your idea of the international agenda of the museum was really interesting. But you were talking at the beginning of the women and museology, and I would like to understand that feminization of the politic that is more evident in South America. Also, when Sandra Benitez talked about the heritage part. So, what's the change? And I don't want to use the word feminism, but what do you think? This topic, how do you think this topic is changing and what's generating? Carolina, for you, thank you so much for the time you dedicated to make us understand the title word by word. You just left out the articles of the sentence. Thank you so much. And I was thinking about the question of the public and the agendas again of the social class. And these are very valid topics, but sometimes we don't talk enough about them. In the case of the exhibitions you talked about, what do you think the impact has been on the migrant communities? And do you think it contributed to this curation, basically? Was this a strategy? And Hassan, maybe it's a difficult question, but I would like to take advantage of your expertise in the topic. It's maybe a personal question, personal interest from my side. It's really surprising for me how the museology gave also its back to all these topics. I think I would really like to have a figure like that one in art that spoke about all these dialogues and all these topics in arts history. And I think there's been a separation, a division that we cannot explain. So I don't really know if you can answer that question, but maybe just try. Thank you so much, Maria, for your question. I think we can say a lot on this topic, but I think the context that I would set is just express the different kind of violence, gender violence, um, and not kind of oppressions. Let's say that I don't really speak just for myself, but all for all the female workers of the museums, that we've basically lived on our skin, mansplaining, whitesplaining, and a lot of other phenomenons. I don't know if there's a translation of whitesplainings in Spanish, um, but I think, as for my case, to decide to start to carry out a work with a woman colleague in these museums helped us to start and think about museology in itself. I always think from an intersectional perspective, and in that sense, I strongly believe that something I've learned is basically thinking using a social conscience and awareness. And I think that's something very interesting to highlight is that this is a process on both sides. Sometimes people victim of racism, sometimes we just think that it's black people or darker people, but sometimes it's not the case. It can happen in different scenarios and different situations, and women were always associated to suspect in general. Everybody suspects a women of our behavior, of how we access the public space. And in that case, you can add social questions, social topics, race topics. Well, of course, the situation gets more complex. And in that sense, I think I've tried to think about a different kind of violence, forms of oppression, as I said before, and I think they are always present. And you always have to be very careful. And every day, every single day, we have to be careful with that. But I think that is my answer. Well, about your question about the impact that I noticed, I'm not really sure about it. There was not really a context like the one we have today, so we were in a kind of in a passive situation, but of course I've been working with a series of person working with me, so that was for me the beginning of a process. And this process started to articulate a whole community. It was a starting point. And it basically developed through the years, and it encountered itself in other spaces afterwards. In 2019, we had another exhibition in the HUSAC, and we gave another step forward in this topic. And after in Madrid, we started with everything you were talking about, the exhibition, when, for example, we had to build our own spaces to talk, and we started to meet each other and to create from there. What happened in that moment in Matadero in Madrid was the starting point of the Afro space of the exhibition, and we started to generate other spaces where we can meet and think and articulate different kind of debates and just talking about what we couldn't talk about in other spaces. And we were able to put all the suffering, all that pain in a space apart from the artistic practice. And we try to find a way to transit all that discrimination that you can live in the everyday life. And I think the impact that it has had is that nowadays, for example, I was thinking about the inauguration of the exhibition in the Thyssen, that it's very important, and to see all those communities supporting us and sustaining us and supporting all these processes is incredible. So I don't want to say that we started it, but this project appeared in a moment when we really needed it, and it didn't exist anything like that. And in the recent years, it has been a communitary process, especially for the communities of the Afrosphere, migrants, and all these part of the communities. And this is a community that just encountered, and we really love each other. I would like to answer your question, even if it's difficult. It's really true that this process is still developed in the 80s and in the 20th century, and I have the feeling that what developed in the museum anthropology is basically a destruction of the idea of lab museum. Traditionally, anthropology museum were full of investigation labs. And the task of the anthropologist was not just working on the collection, but also investigating in the space of the museum. And with the change of the century, we have to analyze it in the framework of this change of century. And we talk about a museum with a lot of imperfections. And with this change of paradigm, what we have is basically we basically were taking advantages of a specific part of it to transform the Museum of Anthropology in museums of universal art. And this was really positive for the political parties, sorry, because it was positive scenarios for them, and we had this idea of recognition of the genius of the creator, so the recognition of these works and equity, the topic of the equity was really vivid and valid. And we had a lot of pressure, especially from the collectionists, and the results of this was that by 2010 we had a space where they had total freedom. In the process of foundation of the museum in Paris, they had the same situation. At the end, what we have in the museum culture, well, we could actually analyze the team that was behind the results of that museum, but they all come from that field, and from the field of tribal production. So in some ways, there's a possibility to open that space, and this opening has very positive results. I was looking at this question actually in 2018. We very started to talk about this kind of questions with the publication of the book, The British Museum. I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years ago.
And right now, we're in this moment in which we have a kind of power play that has a lot to do with the spaces that they were having and the influence that they had on tribal art collectors, and somehow they knew how to acquire these exhibition spaces, and now we are in an impossible regression exercise. What's the advantage of the Spanish museums? But they have the advantage that they have to renew now the contract from the collectionist. If the collectionist decides that that exhibition does not respond to the criteria for collecting, and in the end is just creating a permanent exhibition that is special for that collector. And here in the Anthropology Museum, if we have a renovation of the permanent exhibition, we could do an exercise of work with it, and it is very clear. For example, in the Museum Temondi, we have to have a critical perspective, and the permanent exhibition has to be the same, and that's untouchable. And that's a kind of problem that is an opportunity for us, and it's a it's a problem for them. I think we're good on time, right? I think we have about 10 minutes. Hi. I was thinking about an element that I think is underlying in all the presentations. And I think some years ago, I already participated in Lopez Grau's seminar that was called 4 Days on Repairing, Caring, and Healing. And my talk was called about the impossibility of decolonization, because it seems that museum institutions want to repair, heal, and care for others without taking into account that any decolonization process has to be violent and has to. There is a matter that has not been talked about. You have mentioned Columbus, the photograph of human zoos, and its violent elements of decolonization. I think of J. Mombasa text that is called Redistribution of Violence. So how can we think of the decolonization of a museum, the repair of a damage, healing a wound, without getting back that violence to the colon? I'm not talking about Hernan Cortés and the ones back in the day. I'm talking about those that nowadays are establishing curatorial narratives about us. So I think about another sentence of some activists in Madrid, in Brazil, which is kill the white man inside of you. But it's also those that did it in Equatorial Guinea, because killing the white man, it implicates killing the voice of the white man. But doing an exclusively cosmetic exercise and a superficial aesthetic, just like Elvira said. But we would have to think precisely how to kill the white man inside oneself, and how to avoid white people to go back again to talk about us. That's about curational violence. Good afternoon. I wanted to talk about this matter. I want to ask to Carolina Bustamante and remind her that in the Museum of Anthropology since the 50s, in anthropology, we we should not think about colonial companies. We need to think about institutional relationships in the church and all those institutions that are part of this colonial idea. So remembering that anthropology is the only science that science is the only one to blame from racism, from the present, from the past, and from the future, would be quite a biased kind of possibility. But I also wanted to say that since the 50s, Franz Boas, Sarah New Hairston, and all these people, they started doing deconstruction exercises that were for the anthropology sector, and their mea culpa as well, because that has to do with colonial enterprise. And I wanted to know if you consider this, so that we don't all end up having an identity war. And I would also ask this to Malena Bedoya, because I think it is very weird, colleague Bedoya, that I have been in Ecuador working for the government, the Correa president, sorry, and to see what's the fragmentation that exists in your country with black people from the Emerald Coast. That does not appear when you talk about these matters, because what we're going to do is, in the end, trying to kill each other. In the end, colonial history, just like you said, Amanda de la Garza, this morning, is a story about mistakes, but no one is innocent. in this story. It does not mean that we hide or stop talking about, let's say, the terrible consequences of this problem, not even findings or anything like that, but just terrible options. But not everything was so idyllic in societies where, but those white people also went to bother us. But these things have to be solved without pain or with pain, but just focusing the pain, having eyes in our eyes to be able to repair what is broken. Seems like the gods are moving, right? But for the rest, I wanted to ask you about that consideration. I talked about anthropology because it was linked to human zoos, but actually the problem is much broader, much more complex. And actually, it is trying to be an idea about scientific truth, that moment of accidental talk about the real problem and the real place from where we interpret the world. In the Thyssen-Bornemisza, they have just started an exhibition who of an artist who is from French Guyana. Her name is Tabita Resaire, and she does a mix, which is very interesting, between what's ancestral knowledge. She lives in a village, she cultivates cacao, she works on the indigo, but everything has a connection on what her cultural inheritance would be or heritage would be, and all these ancestral powers of observing the sky, spirituality, and the practice of religiosity, the Yoruba religion, and everything. But she is an admirer and researcher of Western science, of biology, what generates a whole kind of knowledge that also explain the world. And she said in a conversation that I had with her that science is just one more knowledge in the world. It was also what I talked about with Fanon about how whiteness in Occidental science or Western science is things that do not exist directly. But the cartography and ethnography, it's a whole kind of sciences that are intervening. That was just an example. I don't know if you want to answer, Malena. About the correísmo, the current moments that my country is living. I really didn't understand the question, sorry. Because I don't understand how that is related to museums. What I wanted to say is what's the work that Ecuador has with its ethnical fragmentations, because funnily enough I saw that in Ecuador the indigenous people is people that have been treated by the Creoles or urban people just like societies um, um, burden, let's say, and Afro Equatorians even worse. So after the independence, Ecuador has solved its internal fragmentations, right? I don't think any country in Latin America, no country has solved this. When someone talks about the Conaye in my country, and in the 90s, in the political powers, in the Constitution of 2008, it's the constitution that in some way it was called socialism from the 21st century. So inside that, Afro voices in this place had a lot less audience, and it's a racist country, of course. When we talk about the processes of slow death, I thought about some racialized narratives in my country. When we talk about the wood or the oil industries, but what happened over the last years is that the government started to criminalize social protest, which is the famous government of Correa. So women from the Amazon can tell you. So Suarez communities, they started to call them colons, and they got them helicopters on top so that they can. They were acquiring emeralds where there is process of low death. And they don't have any basic needs covered, just like education or health. But I think, and there is a movement that is very much linked with reflections on the Afro aspect, but it is a direct effect of Francia Marquez in Colombia. And I think in this sense that it did not, I don't think it didn't exist. That's why I'm taking this back from the community museology because I think it's necessary to talk about it. I could also talk about the Museum of the Salt because it's from the saline um, from the salines, from the salt mines or salines in Ecuador, and there were many actions done from the theory of liberation and popular education. It is weird that no one has said that Gustavo Gutierrez died about a couple days ago, and he was one of the ideologists of the theory of the liberation of popular education, just like Nidas Praño could be in my country. So I think there is a genealogy of all these fights in the left that is still not explored or named or acknowledged in everything that has been happening. And well, my country now is as it is, but it is very complicated because I'm a new migrant, let's say in this Spanish space, and I've been going through scenarios in the north and in the south, both in Manchester and here in Spain. And yes, I have been a professor in the universities of the south and in museums in the south, but I'm also quite sensitive about this topic. But there are many things to talk about this global capitalism. If you ask me, all fights are anti-capitalist, and we have to say this. And in this sense, and it is very complicated just to give you a broader answer. And of course, oppression keeps on happening, and now it's different fights that are happening. Fernando, just to point something out, I totally agree with what you say, both in the idea of building a community, what is a community, and then, of course, in claiming and affirming anthropology. There are many anthropologies. The Boas anthropology is not from the 50s, it's from the 20s, and the mind from the mind and the anti racist ideas are from the year 20, and yet is the ethnologist against colonialism, then race and culture from Bistros. So there are many kinds of anthropologies, and therefore it is true that there is a lot of lack of knowledge in the anthropological tradition. There's a lot of lack of knowledge even from classical one, and sometimes we don't have to, let's say, break our clothes when we want to mm, claim any kind of anthropology, and I totally agree with you. I'm sorry, I can't hear. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the four of you to have such sensitive participations. And I, first of all, wanted to say brava to Carolina. I wanted to say that you're very brave because there were asked many questions this morning precisely about the structurality through which we integrate the teams in the museums. And well, the fact that I'm here in this table is honestly an act of rebellion, but also an act that asked us to think to the hypocrisy that we have when we create events just such as this, in which we are accomplices to. And on the other hand, also by answering and doing an echo of what Carolina was saying in her presentation. She said, internal colonialism, let's think about it in Latin America, let's think about Spain, about structural racism. And I'm going to give the example of my country, which is Cuba. We had a triumphant revolution in 1959 in which the whole continent looked, and it did not eradicate racism. On the contrary, it made it invisible. And it is not until the year 1997 where we had the first exhibitions on racism, very explicit by denouncing racism in the Cuban society. It's a society that nowadays has even recovered very strongly the exteriority and visibility of racism precisely because of the neoliberal processes that it's living, and where that old regime, that dictatorship, has not helped with the social mobility of the Afro descendant population. And it's a revolution that the whole continent looked at, and the whole Europe from the left, and there we are with the same structural problems. Well, I just wanted to make a comment from the region of the community that I come from, because sometimes there are complications of the new political constitutions of the state that we have in Ecuador and Bolivia, which is very similar. Something that I could perceive, the structure of the formal education is not cohesive with the new political constitution of the state, and that is very clear because so far, for example, universities have not updated their curriculums. Imagine if the political constitution of the state was passed in 2009, in Ecuador in 2008. If universities did not update their curriculums, we have a serious problem there, because even if we might have a good political constitution of the state, the biggest administrative problem and educational problem is always vertical, it's never horizontal. So that is never cohesive with all the actions from the indigenous communities. And when, for example, that starts being a problem in something related to administrative problems, it's two very different structures, because the structures of the academic training tools, they're always received from their roots as something that has to reach as a whitened idea. And look at us among the diversity of the epistemologies and philosophy that is much more complex of what we have today. So I would say that we have to get closer towards that reality. We still have not gotten any closer. Maybe we have some small voices, but they're not big. Well, I just wanted to change the narrative a little bit, but we have to finish. There was a question from someone who's online, so I wanted to give the floor to that person and then make a closing event, and then I would ask the representatives of the organizations if you want to say, let's say, some kind of farewell. So we are very aware of the responsibility we hold. The ones that we have this task of receiving this inheritance, these museums, these collections, with all this pain and this whole trauma that they are lagging. And I remember what Amanda said this morning. That responsibility should not block us, because we of course can't make everyone happy. We need to open up debates and create our own path. But our responsibility, which is also to invite people to come here to participate, to a lot of people from different places, it has a lot to do with this space. And of course it's a physical space, but it's also a social or institutional space in the collections. But this is going to be very useful in the intervention of Carolina to remember that this collection, that inheritance, that aggregate is available for everyone. the decolonization of the museum can be done and is being done among many people who are working with that registry, as Hassan was saying. And well, at least 10 years ago, with critical idea of the migrant reasoning, we gave a series of photographs. We have collaborated with Gamarra. We have also worked, well, you did a video here with your Peruvian colleague who was doing some drawings here, and I could say many other things about collections from other places. The museum can get out through your words, through your actions, and even some objects can go to different exhibitions. We have, of course, several limitations when it comes to standards for conservation, exhibitions, etc. They could be reviewed, but it's just limitations, but it's not impossibilities. But I think there are some conclusions that we can get to today, and it is that we don't exercise any control. It used to be exercised. We think we don't do that when it comes to giving images so that they can explain the narratives. Whoever can do whatever they want from any place they want, anything they want with our images. So we give that openness of making it more accessible to that collection. That could already be part of that decolonization process. It's already being done. So we invite people in the sense of reinterpreting or reassignation of value of these collections or giving evidence through all this pain, through actions, because obviously that still needs to be done. The quid of the question is, of course, in the collection itself, but what I wanted to say was that there are other paths that are not expecting the own limits of the museum that can contribute to the fact that all that memory is reinterpreted so that it's criticized, and that's what we're trying to do from the museum. So we think that's also an important part of taking into account that responsibility beyond legal matters that we can't really cross. I don't know if you would like to move on to the question. There was an online question. Yes, well, Fabiola Morales is following us online, and she's asking, how can we proceed to think about spaces for the acknowledgement of colonial wounds that are still valid or pending in Spain? And she references the Canary Islands specifically, and the museology that makes people be objects through human remains, and why nowadays this is still a taboo topic. It is a question that maybe someone else could answer, maybe Fernando, because anything we say is from outside of the institution. I don't know, what do you think? The review processes and criticism of the Anthropology Museum of Madrid go towards that direction, but I don't know about the protocol of the treatment of human remains in a specific relationship with the Guanche population. I imagine it works the same way, but I can't give any kind of answer. I don't know. I also don't feel with the, let's say, authority or the fact that we don't talk about this is precisely one of the questions that is a question or an affirmation that I made before. That we are, let's say, very ready to talk about decolonizing and repairing when barely there have been any spaces to think what needs to be decolonized and repair. Because barely now I am with a microphone talking about this. And we talk about strategies and how to change it and how do we do it if we haven't even done an exercise of memory. We have not talked about history, about pain, about how this is going to transform society. We have talked about this in other spaces, but we have not talked about this as a society that is coexistent. So why? I really don't know, because the place of speaking has always been in the West, and the West does not want to talk about this. The West gets fragile when they start talking about this. I think, I don't know. I would say so. And suddenly now, there is a certain openness and we're being asked to talk. And it may be the moment to talk about this conflict, but I think that's it so far. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, but Renfe is calling us. Renfe is the train lines in Spain. Thank you to the three of you for having organized this table, and I hope we can see each other in other debates. Thank you.